Good afternoon, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh of the Home Bible College. I want to continue my series on the King James Version. We're commenting on this book, The In the Beginning by Alistair McGrath, but we're also going to be referring to other important works. And in the end, we're going to be referring to a book I wrote on the subject many years ago. So this is chapter 4, and the chapter 4 is called The First Printed English Bibles. Now, having realized the importance of translating the Bible into German, Martin Luther wasted no time in getting on with his task. Okay, and in September 1522, Luther published his German translation of the New Testament. Now, in September, 1522, the German translation of the New Testament came out, and he then continued to work on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That was a massive task. It was a very, very huge task to translate into German. Nonetheless, because sometimes you could be held up on just a word or a phrase and you'd need to rethink it, and a very, very big task indeed. The work represented a translation directly from the Greek into German. Now, there were not a lot of Greek manuscripts available, but they were sufficient to be able to get a very good translation going. Now, one such admirer of Luther was William Tyndale, now widely acknowledged as the most formative influence on the text of the King James Bible. Now, the great pioneer William Tyndale was born in Gloucestershire in England and studied at Magdalen College School in Oxford, from which he went on to attend Magdalen Hall, now Hertford College in Oxford. Tyndale studied in Oxford. Very, very interesting, that is, because it was at Cambridge where they were predominantly Protestants, and where at Oxford they were predominantly Roman Catholic. Now, I know that this is only an approximation, but that this was just a predomination that occurred. Some people think that he then, William Tyndale, went to Cambridge, and it's noted by historians that that's what happened, but however, there's no actual proof and evidence that that's what happened. Tyndale's primary concern was the translation of the scriptures, and such translation required knowledge of the 3 great languages of antiquity, which was Greek and Hebrew and Latin. Now, writers such as Erasmus were actively campaigning for a direct engagement with the text of the Bible in its original languages as the foundation of Christian theology. Funnily enough, in the Home Bible College, this is what we always advocate. It's not so much what translators have said. We need to get back to what was originally written by the apostles. And when he was at Oxford, there were a lot of strange things discussed. I mean, could God reverse time? Can God do anything? Can God make a prostitute into a virgin? Could Christ have become incarnate as a donkey? Or maybe a cucumber? These were the silly intellectual arguments of the theology of those days, and Tyndale regarded them as utterly pointless, stupid waste of time. Now, Tyndale himself was more than a little irritated by his experience of theology at Oxford, not least because it seemed to give the study of Aristotle priority over mastering the Bible. Famously, it was said that the ordained man should look in the scripture no ordained man should look in the scripture until he had spoon-fed himself with the false principles of the heathen men of previous days. So, for example, 8 or 9 years of study in all the false principles of the ancient times would prepare a man for his theology. And of course, Tyndale thought that was utter foolishness, and theology, any theology that was worthy of its name, would only come directly from the scriptures themselves. Now, Oxford and Cambridge were able to supply King James I with an ample supply of Greek and Hebrew scholars at the beginning of the next century, and all of that was due to the fact that what the reformers did is they set up schools of young men who would be familiar with Hebrew and Greek, and that was such an absolutely essential thing. Luther taught himself Hebrew using Johannes Rechlin's primer of 1506, and he acquired an exceptionally good knowledge of Hebrew by those means. Now, Oxford was not really interested in translating the Bible, nor indeed any other work. In fact, that is into English. It was the accepted wisdom of the age that Latin was actually the language of culture and academia, and was the only language worth knowing. And therefore, Luther's works could be read at Oxford and Cambridge without any difficulty whatsoever, because he didn't just translate into German, but he translated into Latin. And Latin was the language of the scholars. Okay, and that meant that Luther's works could be read in the top universities of England very, very easily indeed. They were exceptionally familiar. They were completely fluent in Latin. The sophistication of the book, this was the attitude that they had at Oxford and Cambridge. The sophistication of a book was, after all, inversely proportional to the ease with which it could be read. Okay, in other words, the more complicated a book was, the better it was. And that's the way in which the scholars think. And sadly, a lot of scholars think like that today. This was absolutely, that was contrary to Luther's thinking and totally contrary to Tyndale's thinking. What Tyndale wanted to do, he wanted the boy who followed the plough to be able to understand the scriptures in his own ordinary language, and so did Luther. And one of the things that's very interesting is that Luther did visit Tyndale visited Wittenberg, where Luther was. Did he sit at Luther's feet to be taught? Very difficult to know. We do know this, that in some of Tyndale's works, it almost sounds just like Luther, but that's not surprising. Luther's works were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. Everybody had them, and Tyndale would have been able to get hold of them. And because Tyndale is learning some of these things for the first time, then some of the phrases and some of the thinking, which is captured in phrases, would become part of his ordinary speech. Tyndale didn't need to meet Luther in person. His works were everywhere. So he could pick them up, and he could pick them up at a very good price, and he would be able to be thoroughly conversant with Luther's translation wherever he was. And Luther's translation skills were made evident by the books that he wrote. Tyndale therefore approached Tunstall with a view of obtaining employment in his household. One of the things that Tyndale needed was patronage. He needed people that would help him financially. So he went to Tunstall with a view of obtaining employment in his household, and that would have brought an income. However, the sad thing is that never quite happened. And so Tyndale struggled quite a bit to continue with his work. Tyndale settled eventually in the German city of Cologne. The translation of the New Testament into English was now complete, and the task was now to ensure its printing and distribution. Now, in the prologue to Tyndale's work, three factors were of special interest. The pages included a prologue, which was dependent on points upon Luther's own prologue to his 1522 German New Testament. Okay, and the second thing was that the list of contents in the New Testament followed a convention that existed in the Lutheran circles at this stage. Now, with regard to 4 New Testament works, Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation, as being dubious authenticity. You see, Luther didn't believe that Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation should really be considered as part of the New Testament canon. And Tyndale followed in his wake in the same way. They were placed at the end, of the Bible. They were not numbered, and they were not numbered amongst the New Testament books. Tyndale appears to have been obliged to follow this convention. However, by 1526, he had abandoned that practice. Now, the third thing is that the 1525 printing included marginal notes. The pages that have survived included 90 such notes, suggesting that Tyndale envisaged a new high level of comment on the text throughout the New Testament. However, by 1526, a year later, all such notes have been removed. It was very interesting how that the Bible goes through various stages, and there was a stage in which it was very common to have notes, but there was another stage in which it was common not to have notes. See, this does go in waves. Sometimes notes are helpful and sometimes they're not, especially if they're contrary to opinion. Now, Tyndalls New Testament was the precursor of the King James Bible. The edition of the English New Testament published at Worms in 1526 must be regarded as a landmark in the history of the English Bible. Yet it was the edition of 1526 that was smuggled into England and created irreversible pressure for an English Bible. Now, the name of William Tyndale was never mentioned on the title page of his edition. It was never mentioned. This is probably for a number of reasons. First of all, it enabled the author, the translator, William Tyndale, to remain anonymous. It was a dangerous thing to be a translator of the Bible. No information of the publisher or of the place of publication was provided at any point. And in fact, the work advertised itself simply as New Testament. That's all it said, without making any mention of its translator, save to those in the know, and the origins of the work lay shrouded in mystery. Now, the form of English that was in the Tyndale New Testament was what we would call, and what he called, proper English. It's not so much that he wanted it to be highbrow or high-bred English. What he wanted it to be was the right English word to convey the correct meaning. In other words, the criteria he had was accuracy and clarity. Accuracy and clarity. We will see that this theme is recurring again and again. In fact, the King James Bible itself, one of the great things about it was accuracy and clarity. It was one of the supreme virtues of the translators. Certain aspects of Tyndale's translation were instantly perceived as a threat to the more conservative English Catholics. Tyndale insisted that the Greek word presbytos, used in Paul's letters to refer to an office within the Christian church, traditionally was translated as priest, but it should be rendered as senior. Okay, and the 1534 he altered this to elder, and that's what we're familiar with today. The English word priest should, he argued, be reserved solely for translating the Greek word hieros, used in the New Testament exclusively to refer to the Jewish or pagan priests. The Greek word ecclesia, traditionally translated as church, was now translated as congregation. And as a result, many New Testament references that could be taken to endorsing the institution of the state church were now understood to be referring to the local congregation of believers. So you can see, can't you, that Tyndale's translation was an incredible improvement in conveying the right words to the readers. And there's a number of examples in this book here, the first printed English Bible, in which he explains the words that he chose. Sometimes what Tyndale would do is he would choose words which are strange to the modern reader, but which convey an idea which is much more accurate. I'll give you an example of that. When we think of the Lord healing a lame man or a crippled man, he just uses the word halt, a halt man, somebody that cannot move, somebody that is stopped. The King James Bible changed one lust into a covet without good reason. And sometimes, the translations of the King James Version were regressive. They were not as good as what Tyndale originally had. That's a sad thing, that very often that was the case. Now, secondly, Tyndale generally avoided all Latin words or Latinate words, preferring to English them. Okay. On occasions, this means using words that are only recently introduced or coining new words altogether. Yet in this passage, he chose to use the word concoctions, which was already in the Vulgate translation of the text, despite the fact that already he had used in English the word lust. Okay. So sometimes Tyndale was not even consistent with himself. Sometimes he would choose a particular word to convey an idea, and it wasn't necessarily a word that he would use in other places to say the same thing. Is that making sense? I hope it is. Now, the impact of Tyndale's translation was immense. There is ample evidence to suggest that many used Tyndale's New Testament to learn to read. It was actually a way of being able to become literate. Now, for example, in 1520, William Malden related how, though initially illiterate, he was determined to learn to read so that he might have access to Tyndale's New Testament for himself, despite the opposition of his father, who preferred his religion to be in Latin. Okay. Now, Tyndale was a master of the pithy phrase, and there are a tremendous number of phrases in the English language which we all use, which were absolutely created entirely by Tyndale. Tyndale coined phrases. He coined, for example, the powers that be. He coined that. He made that phrase. He also coined the phrase, my brother's keeper. He also invented the phrase, the salt of the earth. Some people think that the phrase the salt of the earth came from the apostles, but of course the apostles never spoke English. So what Tyndale was doing is he was actually coining phrases that would actually convey what he considered to be the correct meaning. He also invented the phrase, a law unto themselves. Okay. Now these phrases continue to be used even in modern English, and precisely because they're so well shaped in terms of their alliteration or their rhyme or the word repetitions or the poetry sometimes of the phrase. Tyndale also introduced it or revised many words that are still in use. He was the one who constructed the term Jehovah from the Hebrew construction known as the Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament. He invented the English word Passover to refer to the Jewish festival known in Hebrew as Pisha. Now, other theologians developed by Tyndale to translate biblical words that had up to that point no real English word equivalent, included scapegoat. He invented the word scapegoat. He also invented the word atonement. The word atonement had the concept of reconciliation, and that's the word that he penned for the first time. Now, occasionally he would write a word which was very cumbersome and not at all a good word in English, but that was the mistake. That's the risk that you take when you're a person that's having to do such a radical translation as this. And once Tyndale's translation of the New Testament was widely available, there was no turning back, and Tyndale's translation would have to be authorized, or it would have to be bettered. Somebody would have to do something better, or the king would have to sanction it. There seemed to be no alternative, and Henry's advisors chose the latter, which was to do nothing at all. They didn't authorize it, and they didn't decide to do anything any better. So they just sat still and did nothing. Eventually, they would produce their own Bible and require it to be used in public worship in the churches. Now, Tyndale can thus be said to have achieved two remarkable successes. First, by producing an excellent English New Testament, and secondly, by forcing the hand of the English church and the state to undertake something that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier, which is an officially sanctioned English Bible. The immediate reaction of the English establishment was not to authorize Tyndale's translation, still less to produce one superior to it, and throughout 1526 a relentless campaign began to suppress the book. Okay, and we'll talk about that in our next episode. They used every means possible to prevent Tyndale's translation, which was being produced in Antwerp, to come into Britain for the English people to read. So we look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. Have a great day, and we look forward to you then. Bye for now.